You may begin.
Sridhar, share your screen.
Are you okay to start sharing your screen now? Okay.
So, hi everyone, I hope you guys are doing well. Today we're going to be talking about the ramifications of the housing crisis. Now, my name is Aditya, and these are my two group members, Sridhar and Tirth. And to start off, we're going to introduce our introduction and goal. Sridhar, you have to change the slide. And can you present the slide, Sridhar? Go into slideshow and present. There you go. Thank you. So in starting off talking about our introduction and goal, we're going to start talking about the key findings from our poster. So our poster really narrowed in on the factors and trends contributing to the rising housing prices in Canada. So what we kind of learned from our poster was that, we talked about construction prices, increase in debt and student debt, income rising disproportionately to prices, and supply of single detached homes. And we ended it off with a regression model and a bit of a sensitivity analysis. Now, what you see on the right side of the PowerPoint slide is this kind of iceberg. And what we're trying to convey with the iceberg is that in face value, when we think about the housing crisis, we often just look at, the housing prices, the debt levels, the mortgage rates. But, upon, partaking in this competition, we learned that the housing crisis is actually a lot more complicated than that. And, what you often don't see is the things below the water in the iceberg and other factors contributing to the housing crisis, such as, mental health and overcrowded housing. So essentially, our goals today are as follows. We want to answer the questions such as what else is impacting the housing affordability crisis, who is being affected, and number 3, how do we mitigate the negative impacts on the most vulnerable communities?
So now let's look at the most impacted groups due to COVID-19. And the first group that we're going to look at is students and recent graduates. This was the first group that came to mind because they were the first ones to voice their opinions about losing workplace placements and internships and co-ops due to the implications of lockdown measures. In fact, 17% of graduates were not able to complete their degree, diploma, or certificate as planned. Furthermore, employment of students also decreased to 29.8% in April compared to 52.8% in February of 2020. So during this time, the government also provided CESB for some financial aid. However, on the graph that we can see that despite providing financial aid, a large proportion of students were still worried about their finances, whether that be using up the savings for their expenses, increasing their student debt, paying for next term's tuition, or even paying for the current expenses. So on the next slide, let's look at how we're gonna see changes after COVID. So after COVID, students will have an additional cost of tuition and expenses due to delayed graduation. And loss of experience from losing work placements will result in increased barriers to entry into the workforce. So the graphic that we have right below it is from our poster where we talked about increasing student debt levels in general. And we just want to emphasize that after COVID, this will be even higher because of loss of workplace experience and additional cost. So how can we make this better? Many millions of dollars on academic scholarships go unclaimed due to lack of awareness. So increasing marketing for these financial aid scholarships will provide financial aid and reduce debt at graduation. We can also increase awareness for financial literacy because this is the population that is new to handling their finances, are new to getting a first job and having an income, and how to manage that could be a little tricky. So if we provide education for that, it would be certainly helpful, especially when they're saving for their first house or saving for a down payment further down the line. Srijit, you're on mute.
Next, we chose to look at low-income families, and we decided to narrow in on them because they looked like the group that was impacted the most during the COVID pandemic due to multiple job losses or permanent layoffs. As we see here, 45% of low-wage service industry workers who were employed within the food, the entertainment, or just services industry as a whole were faced with permanent layoffs. Seeing that low-income families worked in these sort of sectors, they didn't necessarily have the education level, or they weren't offered with the ability to work from home. And so seeing that, the government decided to implement fiscal policies such as CERB in order to combat the lost wages. But for some reason, the 75% isn't sufficient enough because an average worker is able to reap benefits of 100% from their regular work. And so to compensate for the 25% that's lost from CERB itself, some Canadians had to resort to payday loans, or they had to borrow funds, or some of them also had to resort to EI or employment insurance in order to recuperate some of the losses from CERB. Post-COVID, some of these trends will kind of follow and will be seen even afterwards. So we can see that layoffs and workers, we can see that workers who suffered layoffs are also going to be faced with merit pay issues. So some of them who had accumulated years of experience are no longer going to be as valuable to the same industry again, just because of the revolving employment market. They're now going to be faced with other barriers of entry, such as a younger working force or just a technological advancement within the workforce itself. That's also going to lead to a lack of high productivity employer and employee match, which is also going to impede an employee to employee connection. So in order to combat that, we decided to look a little deeper into the issue. And we saw that the awareness amongst this community or just their struggles aren't as highlighted as we think they are. And so in order to highlight their struggles, we can encourage that through food bank donations or charity drives, or just regular or a common man general solution by just raising awareness for their struggles.
The group that was affected were tenants. And many tenants were subjected to unsafe evictions, which led them to seek shelter in care homes. And this was okay until care homes became overwhelmed and couldn't increase capacity due to physical distancing requirements. This pushed the tenants who were evicted from care homes to homelessness. Overall, 70% of renters were impacted financially, while 34% of families were missing rent payments. And 7% of renters in Ontario were unable to pay rent in full after losing their income. So after COVID, next slide, please. Thank you. After COVID, rent freezes will eventually end and annual rent increases will resume. Rent assistance will also end and eviction protection will also end, which will mean that any notices that were served will be enforced fully. So how do we combat this? So we can look to increase the length of halting rent increases past the pandemic. This will allow tenants to regain employment, which they possibly have lost, or regain income that they've lost, and help build their savings. We can also have federal government programs to assist with rent payments, where the government helps to pay a percentage of the rent as long as the tenant is working and trying to regain their income and savings.
So seeing these three different groups, we were able to conclude that low-income families are the most vulnerable and they're most affected by the ongoing pandemic, paired with the ongoing housing affordability crisis.
So now we're going to talk about the socioeconomic factors. So what we mean by socioeconomic factors is really kind of the underwater factors that were attached to the iceberg earlier in our introduction. So in our next slide, we have the housing continuum. Now, my group was first introduced to this housing continuum yesterday during the keynote speaker event. And really it struck a chord with us because it was crucial in helping us realize the housing crisis is a lot bigger than we thought. right? So we're going to try to talk about some of these intricate relationships and why the government needs to focus on these relationships in particular. For example, how do we get a person from community housing to affordable rental? Well, the continuum tells us that we need improved employment. So we're going to start off by talking about mental health and domestic abuse. If you can change the slide, thank you. So I'll just read off some few statistics. So for example, right now, the current wait time to get some mental health help in Canada is 67 days, which is a little over a month. Another statistic is Canadians in the lowest income group are 3 to 4 times more likely to report poor to fair mental health. And in terms of domestic violence, we have domestic violence calls have increased, almost doubled during the pandemic. And Women's Helpline received 20,000 plus calls between October 1st and to December 31st, 2020, which is the second wave of the pandemic. So why does this matter? Well, Sridhar, if you want to go back to the, thank you. Well, if you take a look at the housing continuum and the people at the right of the continuum, a lot of the times people who are in a great market rental or owned homes have to leave their homes. And why do they have to leave their homes? Well, the continuum tells us that, well, they get evicted, and oftentimes they get evicted because of mental health issues that impacts their ability to make payments, or because because of family or domestic violence, they have no choice but to leave and have nowhere to go. And we can't stop this without proper investment into mental health programs and support for victims. If someone needs help for their mental health issues, why do they have to wait over 2 months on average to talk to a specialist, right? This is a problem, and a problem that can be fixed. And in fixing this problem, we can stop the shift from right to left in the housing continuum. Next, we're going to talk about the supply of social and affordable homes. So again, we have some key statistics, right? So only 6% of Canada's housing market is social and affordable homes. And the problem with the social and affordable homes is they come at this particular moment, they come with their own set of problems. So for one, it's overcrowded. In Toronto, 16.2% of renters in social or affordable homes are experiencing overcrowding. I think in the keynote speaker event yesterday, Kelly spoke about 283,000 about the wait list. And, we found a statistic that says 283,000 households are waitlisted for affordable housing. There are also some other issues like conditions and safety of social homes. So a lot of these social homes are maybe not in the best of locations. And in those locations, the crime rates are a little bit high. So safety is insecure. Number two, the conditions of these houses are also not the greatest because the majority of these social homes are actually built between 1946 to 1993. And if the government hasn't been, allocating a little bit of money for these particular causes, then they haven't been able to repair these houses. And I'm sure you can imagine after almost a full century, a lot of these houses can get quite run down. So again, how does this connect to the continuum? Well, if we're trying to shift people from homelessness to social housing, how can we do that with the lack of supply, right? So if we want, when someone from a market home gets evicted for whatever reason and has nowhere to go, ideally, hopefully they should end up in at least have some support at a community housing or social housing. But if there's lack of supply and there's a huge wait list, they will go past traditional housing and social housing straight to homelessness, which we want to mitigate, which we want to stop. And if we were to talk about the next and last factor, it's the inefficient use of government funds. So, as Canadian citizens, I think it's safe to say that we consider our country safe, both inside our borders and outside our borders. So the question is, why do we need to allocate $20.9 billion to military spending when so many people within the borders are struggling with other things like housing affordability, mental health, and domestic violence support, right? So if you look at the budgets, affordable and social housing had $1.9 billion allocated to it, mental health only $500 million, and preventing domestic violence only $3.4 million, while, like I said earlier, military spending had $20.9 billion. Now I'll pass it on to my friend there.
So in phase one of the competition, we analyzed the data behind the housing crisis and what was increasing the prices of the homes. And now we just finished looking at the groups that were most affected and what socioeconomic factors also contributed to that. So now let's look at the long-term implications of the recommendations that we talked about previously. So as Aditya mentioned, military spending has been very high considering the fact that we pride ourselves as being a peacekeeping nation and we are no longer going through a major war period. So if government is able to allocate small funds from military spending to such as investment in affordable housing, mental health programs, increase in student grants, and other programs like that, we can see a slow shift from homelessness further right of the housing continuum, which will allow more individuals to be stable and afford housing in the future.
So now when we look at some of the things Dirk mentioned, right, like investment into affordable housing, well, when you have a long-term outlook, there are other implications that come into play. For example, the implications of this new capital outlay. So for example, when you increase investment in affordable housing, this will also increase local transit needs, education facilities. So what we mean by this, if, for example, Toronto is quite dense in terms of housing, then they might have to create social housing in other places. Now, if they create social housing in other neighborhoods, well, they need to ensure that there's intricate community networks, like roads. They need to have, for those new neighborhoods, they need to have medical facilities, recreation centers, education facilities, and commuting, need to meet commuting needs. Now, based on everything that Did said and what I just kind of said over here with the implications of the new capital outlay, I'm sure it's kind of, as a government, it could be daunting to look at, because this is a lot of capital investment, a lot of capital expenditure. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars. So how do we how are they going to be incentivized to, invest such a large sum of money at this present moment? Well, what we came up with is that this gradual shift from left to right within the housing continuum is actually good for the economy, right? It's good for the government themselves. And if we're able to appropriately reduce the number of people moving down the continuum, that is, again, also really good for the economy. So why is it good for the economy? Well, doing some of these things, investing into these programs will increase the level of educated people in our population. Furthermore, like we said, the implications of all this new capital outlay, what that's going to start is a lot of jobs are going to become available. We'll need work for a lot of construction work and a lot of other things. And when these jobs become available, more people with income results in more people with income, which in turn equals more income tax revenue for the government in the long term. Now, essentially what we're trying to get at is that, like, yes, right now this capital investment to fix the housing crisis is massive. It's a lot of money, but in the long term, there will be a return on investment. And in the long term, we're talking maybe a random number of, I could say, like even 30 to 50 years, right? This is something that will take time. And pass it off to my friend Srijo.
So just to conclude, today we saw different aspects of the housing crisis with regards to the top of the iceberg and to what was submerged below the iceberg. And so when looking at that, we can kind of conclude based off of the past two slides that we just talked about, that when they are paired all together, so in our poster, we kind of recommended 3 different changes that can be implemented, which were mortgage rate changes, if they were increased at a steadily rate, or construction prices, if we can learn to combat them in a way that we can bring them lower over time, or if we can increase the supply of desired homes, maybe apart from the Greenbelt provision, then we can combat the housing crisis as a whole and get the entire illustration of the iceberg under control. With regards to what we talked about today, it had a social and economic impact on the housing crisis. And once the recommendations are all paired together, we can take a bigger step towards combating the housing crisis or the housing affordability crisis. And that's it for today. So thank you for your time. And at this moment, we'll welcome any questions that the judges have for us. Thank you.
Great presentation, gentlemen. I will open up the floor to the judges. Do any of the judges have a question that they would like to ask?
I'm trying to think. I'm just kind of like processing the information. This is a really fantastic presentation. There was just so much information, and I really appreciated that you kind of looked at it from so many different angles, and like you used that continuum really effectively to look see how it was connected, how like different pieces of this issue kind of all fit together. So I'm not sure that I have a question, honestly. I guess I would say, like, if you could, out of the recommendations you made, if you could only pick one, like, what would you as a group think was the most important recommendation to act on first?
I think something that would really help the housing crisis would be increasing supply for social homes. Because right now, as Aditya was talking, he said that right now people get evicted. Since there's this long wait list, they're forced into homelessness. And if there's increased supply of social homes, then instead of people just going on the streets, we have a shelter for them, and that's like a morale booster. That's one less stress that they have to worry about, and they can work to build their life back up. And everything else just kind of falls into place after that. That's one big element that we agreed as a group.
Yeah, if I was to maybe add something to that, I would also say that the supply of social homes is definitely really, really important. But something else we could kind of couple together with that is that from our poster research that we did, which we focused on trends and factors, we noticed that construction prices have been really significantly increasing the housing prices of Canada. And I guess so, like, if we were to answer your question, I guess supply of social homes, we need to increase that for sure. And then also the government really needs to start allocating some type of programs, like we mentioned in our presentation, like apprentice programs to, solve the labor shortage in the construction industry, to decrease construction costs and everything. That will allow for the housing prices to also decrease. So I think those two things coupled together would really kind of be our, I guess, two biggest takeaways in a sense from all the research we did. Yeah.
If I could just add on and just tag along to what Aditya just said. With regards to the construction prices, I think we also looked at prefabricated homes or modularized homes. And if that's the growing trend, and if government can incentivize those programs more, that can also help combat labor shortages in other ways. For example, so creating or prefabricated homes, we can employ other factors of the supply chain and then eventually lead to an overall economic perspective.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Great presentation. It was very interesting to take a different lens in the presentation. I think what I didn't see, you guys look at it from a Canada perspective, but if you dig into the number, was there a specific province that you felt like there is more room or there's a better opportunity to start and do a little test and learn and then go from there? Was there anything that you guys found that is like from a short term, mid-term, and long term? What would that look like based on your recommendation?
So that's a great question, actually. For our poster recommendation, we kind of saw different provinces, and specifically, we also targeted hotspots on our poster. So in part one of the competition, we looked at cities like Toronto, Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, Ottawa. And so with regards to that, I think to your question, we would start first at Ontario, so a lot closer to home. Just because there are two hotspot cities here in Ontario that are increasing at a rapid rate. With regards to the social and the economic factors that we spoke of today, those are also more prevalent within Ontario. So I think Ontario would be our test center or our pilot project.
Perfect, thank you.
How are we doing for time, Stephen?
We still have a couple of minutes if you have a question you'd like to get in there, Jim.
Sure. So can you go back to your slide on the continuum, if you don't mind?
Yep.
I'm going to take a little bit. Or yeah, that one was fine. So yeah, I guess this is more of a question than anything, which I think is that you've done a really good job in employing the continuum. I assume these arrows and these, well, what part of it is yours? Why don't you tell me that? I know the continuum itself is not, but are these arrows and directional arrows and everything, are those yours or are those part of the published version?
No, it was still from Google Images.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay, okay, okay.
Yeah, we kind of
Um,
use it as a tool, or so. It's the continuum itself. These pictures and really ours now.
Right, okay, thank you.
Okay, if nobody else has any questions, last chance. All right, we're gonna wrap this up. I'd like to thank you again for your excellent presentation. And we will get ready for presentation number 7, starting at 2 p.m. Momentarily. Thanks so much.
Thank
for
you.
your